Robert had been sleeping under the old bridge for almost 3 years now. At 52 years old, he never imagined his life would turn out this way. He used to have a job, a small apartment, and a routine that made sense. But one bad fall at the construction site changed everything. His back injury meant he couldn't lift heavy things anymore, and the medical bills piled up faster than he could count. Eventually, the landlord knocked on his door with an eviction notice, and just like that, the streets became his home. The spot under the bridge wasn't much, but it was his. He'd found a corner that stayed mostly dry when it rained, hidden enough that people didn't bother him, but close enough to the church on 5th Street where they handed out meals twice a week. He kept his area clean, folded his sleeping bag every morning, and tried to maintain whatever dignity he had left. November had arrived with bitter cold winds that cut through his worn jacket like knives. On this particular evening, Robert sat with his back against the concrete wall holding the only food he had. Earlier that day, the church volunteers had given him half a loaf of bread. It wasn't much, but if he was careful, he could make it last until Monday when the soup kitchen opened again. He broke off a small piece and chewed it slowly, trying to make it feel like more than it was. That's when he noticed her. A young woman sat about 20 feet away, hugged her knees to her chest, shaking uncontrollably. She looked terrified, her eyes darting around like a trapped animal. Robert had seen enough people on the streets to know the difference between someone who'd been out here for a while and someone who was brand new to this nightmare. This woman was definitely new. He watched her for a few minutes, debating with himself. He had so little. That bread was supposed to get him through the next 2 days, but looking at her, seeing how scared she was, brought back memories of his own first nights on the streets. The confusion, the fear, the overwhelming feeling that the world had forgotten you existed. Robert stood up, his back protesting with a familiar ache, and walked over to her. She looked up at him with wide eyes, and he could see she was probably in her late 20s, maybe early 30s. Her clothes were cleaner than his, barely worn, which confirmed his suspicion that she hadn't been out here long. "Hey," he said softly, not wanting to startle her more than she already was. "You look cold." She nodded, not saying anything, her teeth chattering. Robert held out half of his bread. "Here, you should eat something." For a moment, she just stared at the bread like she couldn't believe what she was seeing. Then tears started rolling down her cheeks. I can't take your food," she whispered. "Sure you can," Robert said with a gentle smile. "Trust me, I know what it's like. Your first few days out here are the hardest." Slowly, she reached out and took the bread. Her hands were shaking so badly she almost dropped it. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking. "Thank you so much." Robert sat down next to her, keeping a respectful distance. They ate in silence for a while, the sounds of the city humming above them. Cars crossed the bridge overhead, their drivers heading home to warm houses, completely unaware of the 2 people sitting beneath them. "I'm Robert," he finally said. "Linda," she replied quietly. "I've only been out here for 2 days." And then, like a dam breaking, her story came flooding out. She'd run away from her boyfriend who'd been hurting her for months. She had a little girl, only 5 years old, staying with a friend temporarily. Linda had left with nothing but the clothes on her back, too scared to go back for anything else. She was trying to figure out how to get back on her feet so she could get her daughter back, but everything seemed impossible. Robert listened without interrupting. He'd learned that sometimes people just needed someone to hear them, to acknowledge that their pain was real. When she finished, he could see the hopelessness in her eyes, the same look he'd seen in the mirror countless times. "Listen," he said. "I know it feels like you're drowning right now, but there are places that can help. There's a women's shelter on 7th Avenue. They have programs for people in your situation. And the community center on Washington Street, they have job postings and can help with resumes." Linda looked at him with surprise. "Really?" "Really," Robert nodded. "It took me a while to learn about all the resources in this city. I wish someone had told me when I first ended up out here." They talked for another hour. Robert shared everything he knew about surviving on the streets, which places were safe, which ones to avoid, when the different shelters served meals, and where she could take a shower. He could see hope slowly returning to her face, replacing some of the fear. As the night grew colder, Robert noticed Linda shivering even more violently. He looked at his only blanket, the threadbare thing that had kept him warm for the past year. Then he looked at her, and the decision was easy. "Here," he said, handing her the blanket. "You need this more than I do." "No, I can't," Linda protested. "What will you use?" "I've got my sleeping bag," Robert said, even though he knew one sleeping bag wouldn't be enough on a night this cold. "You take it, please." Linda wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, fresh tears streaming down her face. "I don't understand," she said. "You don't even know me. Why are you being so kind?" Robert thought about that for a moment. "Because somebody should be," he finally said. "Because you're scared and alone, and I remember what that feels like. Because maybe tomorrow someone will be kind to me when I need it, or maybe they won't, and that's okay too. Kindness doesn't need a reason." They sat together until Linda felt brave enough to walk to the shelter Robert had mentioned. Before she left, she hugged him tightly. "I'll never forget this," she said. "Never." Robert watched her disappear into the night, then wrapped his sleeping bag tighter around himself. His stomach growled with hunger, and he knew the cold night ahead would be rough without his blanket. But somehow he felt warmer inside than he had in years. What Robert didn't know was that someone had been watching the entire exchange, someone who would remember what they'd seen, someone whose life would be changed forever by witnessing one simple act of kindness on a cold November night. And exactly 1 year later, nothing would ever be the same again. 3 blocks away from that bridge, Daniel Chen sat in his car staring at his phone. The engine had died right in the middle of this rundown neighborhood, and he was waiting for his roadside assistance to arrive. At 68 years old, he'd dealt with plenty of inconveniences in his life, but tonight he was especially irritated. He had a business dinner to get to, deals to close, money to make. Daniel was what people called a self-made millionaire. He'd built his real estate empire from absolutely nothing, starting as the son of immigrants who'd worked themselves to the bone in restaurant kitchens. He remembered wearing second-hand clothes to school, watching his parents count pennies to buy groceries. That hunger, that fear of being poor again, had driven him to work harder than anyone else. And it had paid off. He now owned half the commercial buildings in the downtown area, but success had come with a price that Daniel was only beginning to understand. His daughter hadn't spoken to him in 5 years. The last time they'd talked, she'd said something that still haunted him. "Dad, you've become someone I don't recognize anymore. You care more about money than people. You've lost your soul somewhere along the way." He'd been angry at her then, defensive, but lately in quiet moments her words echoed in his head. As he sat in his car, frustrated and cold, he noticed movement under the bridge nearby. 2 people were sitting there in the shadows. Daniel found himself watching them, more out of boredom than genuine interest. He saw an older man, clearly homeless by the look of him, approach a younger woman who seemed scared and lost. Then Daniel watched something that made him sit up straighter. The homeless man was offering the woman food. From what Daniel could see, it wasn't much, just some bread. But the way the woman reacted, crying and thanking him, told Daniel that this small gesture meant everything to her. Daniel couldn't hear their conversation, but he watched them talk for a long time. The homeless man seemed to be explaining things, pointing in different directions, sharing information. And then, in a moment that made Daniel's chest tighten, he watched the man give the woman his blanket. The only blanket he had. Something about that scene struck Daniel deep in his core. Here was a man who had nothing, literally nothing, giving away what little he possessed to a complete stranger. No cameras were watching. No one was there to praise him. He just did it because it was the right thing to do. Daniel thought about his own day. He'd spent the morning negotiating a deal where he'd squeezed an extra $100,000 out of a struggling business owner. He'd felt proud of himself then, clever for getting every penny he could. He had millions in the bank, multiple homes, more money than he could spend in a lifetime. Yet when was the last time he'd actually helped someone without thinking about what he'd get in return? The roadside assistance truck finally arrived and the mechanic got his car running again. But Daniel didn't drive away immediately. He sat there watching the homeless man huddle in his sleeping bag after the woman left, trying to keep warm without his blanket. "You okay, sir?" the mechanic asked through the window. Daniel nodded slowly. "Yeah, just thinking." Over the next few days, Daniel couldn't shake what he'd witnessed. It bothered him during meetings. It kept him awake at night. He found himself wondering about that homeless man. Who was he? How did he end up on the streets? And how could someone with so little still have so much humanity? Daniel did something he rarely did. He called his personal assistant and asked her to find out about the homeless man under the bridge. It took a week, but she came back with information. His name was Robert. He'd been a construction worker before an injury left him unable to do physical labor. Medical bills had bankrupted him and he'd lost his apartment. Despite applying to hundreds of jobs, no one would hire him. The report also included information about the woman, Linda. She was running from an abusive relationship, trying to get back on her feet so she could reunite with her young daughter. She'd gone to the shelter Robert had recommended and was starting to get help. Daniel sat in his office reading these reports, feeling something he hadn't felt in years, shame, deep, uncomfortable shame. He thought about his daughter's words again. Had he really lost his soul? He looked around his expensive office at the awards on his walls, the photos of properties he owned. All of it suddenly felt empty. For weeks, Daniel wrestled with himself. Part of him wanted to forget what he'd seen and go back to business as usual. But another part, a part he thought had died long ago, was waking up. He started thinking about his own parents, how they'd helped other immigrant families even when they barely had enough for themselves. When had he stopped being like them? One night, unable to sleep, Daniel got out of bed and went to his home office. He pulled up information about the area around that bridge. He noticed something interesting. The land there, including the spot where Robert slept, was part of a city-owned parcel that was up for auction. Nobody wanted it. It was near industrial areas, had zoning complications, and the noise from the bridge made it undesirable for most developments. But as Daniel studied the maps and zoning laws, an idea began forming in his mind. A crazy idea, an idea that made no business sense whatsoever. And maybe that's exactly why it felt right. He spent the next several months working on a plan. He attended boring city council meetings, something he usually sent his lawyers to handle. He talked to architects about designs that could work in that difficult space. He bought the land through a shell company so nobody would know it was him. But Daniel knew this couldn't just be about throwing money at a problem. Robert had pride. Daniel had seen that in the way he carried himself, even while living on the streets. Whatever Daniel did, it had to be done in a way that respected that dignity. Daniel also started following Robert from a distance, not in a creepy way, but wanting to understand this man who'd taught him such an important lesson. He learned that Robert helped other homeless people, sharing whatever he learned about resources and safe places. He saw Robert stop a teenager from robbing an elderly woman, talking the kid down with patience and wisdom. He watched Robert maintain his humanity in circumstances that would have broken most people. With each observation, Daniel became more certain of his plan. This wasn't just about one act of kindness he'd witnessed. This was about recognizing that some people are truly special, and when life knocks them down unfairly, those of us who can help should do something about it. But Daniel knew he had to be patient. He had to do this right. Robert deserved more than charity. He deserved opportunity, respect, and a chance to rebuild his life on his own terms. As winter turned to spring, Daniel's plan began taking solid shape. The permits were approved. The architects had their designs ready. The construction crews were lined up. Everything was in place. Now came the hardest part, finding a way to help Robert without destroying his dignity in the process. Daniel knew he had to be smart about this. He couldn't just walk up to Robert and hand him money or offer him a place to live. That would be insulting. Robert wasn't looking for handouts. He was looking for opportunities, for a chance to earn his way back to a normal life. So Daniel started planning carefully. He hired a private investigator, but not for the usual reasons people hire them. He wanted to understand how he could actually help both Robert and Linda without turning their struggles into some kind of public spectacle. This wasn't about making himself feel good or getting praise. This was about doing something right for once. The information about Linda came together first. Through his business connections, Daniel quietly arranged for her to get an interview at a marketing company owned by an old colleague. He made sure the women's shelter she was staying at received an anonymous donation that included professional clothes for job interviews. He ensured that information about affordable housing reached her through the shelter's social workers. But here's the important part. Daniel never let Linda know he was involved. Every opportunity that came her way, she earned herself. He just made sure those opportunities actually existed and that she knew about them, because the truth was Linda was smart and capable. She just needed the barriers removed, the doors opened that were usually slammed in the faces of people in her situation. With Robert, things were more complicated. Daniel learned that before his injury, Robert had been really good at his job. People respected him. He was known for his honesty and his eye for quality work. The medical records showed his back had healed enough that he could do lighter work, supervise projects, things like that. But who was going to hire a 52-year-old homeless man who hadn't worked in 3 years? That's when Daniel had his real breakthrough. The land he'd bought under the bridge, that difficult parcel nobody wanted, could become something special. Not just another money-making property, but something that actually helped people. He started imagining a community development. Affordable apartments for families struggling to make rent. A community center with job training programs. Small business spaces for local entrepreneurs who couldn't afford downtown rents. And at the heart of it all, right where Robert slept every night, would be the main building. A 3-story structure that would tie the whole community together. Daniel spent months refining this vision. He brought in architects who actually cared about people, not just fancy designs. He talked to community organizers to understand what the neighborhood really needed. This wasn't going to be some gentrification project that pushed poor people out. This was going to be something that lifted them up, but he still needed to figure out how to bring Robert into this without it seeming like charity. That's when Daniel had another idea. He needed someone to manage the construction project, someone who understood building, who knew the neighborhood, and who would fight to make sure everything was done right. Someone who would see this as more than just another job. Daniel created a legitimate position, not a fake job, but a real role that genuinely needed to be filled. Project liaison and community coordinator, someone who would work between the construction crews, the architects, and the neighborhood residents. Someone with construction knowledge who could spot problems early and keep everything on track. Then he had his assistant start quietly asking around the neighborhood. They went to the soup kitchen, the shelters, the community centers, and asked if anyone knew somebody reliable who understood construction and knew the area well. They didn't mention Robert's name. They just asked, and guess what? Robert's name kept coming up. The volunteers at the church mentioned him. Other homeless people praised him. Even some local shop owners who'd seen him around spoke well of him. Robert had built a reputation for being helpful and honest, even while living on the streets. This was perfect. When Daniel finally approached Robert with the job offer, it wouldn't be fake. It would be based on legitimate recommendations from the community. Robert would be able to take pride in earning this opportunity, but Daniel knew he needed a buffer. He couldn't be the one to offer Robert the job directly. That might raise questions. So he had his project manager, a good man named William, make the approach. William didn't know the whole story. He just knew he was supposed to find a reliable person for a legitimate job, and Robert's name had come up multiple times. While all this was being set up, Daniel watched as Linda's life started turning around. She got the job at the marketing firm. She worked hard and impressed everyone. Within 2 months, she'd saved enough for a deposit on a small apartment. Her daughter came to live with her again. Sometimes Daniel would see them at the park near his office, Linda pushing her little girl on the swings, both of them laughing. Those moments made Daniel feel something he hadn't felt in years. Not pride in making money, but genuine happiness at seeing someone succeed. He thought about calling his daughter to tell her what he was doing, but he stopped himself. This wasn't about redemption or proving something. This was about doing the right thing because it was right, not because he wanted credit for it. Spring arrived, and with it came the start of construction. The city had approved all the permits. The plans were finalized. The construction crews were ready to begin. Everything was in place. Daniel stood at the edge of the property one morning, looking at the spot under the bridge where he'd first seen Robert give away his last bread and only blanket. In a few months, that spot would be transformed. But first, he needed to bring Robert into this properly. He gave William the go-ahead to make the approach. Remember, Daniel told him, this has to be real. If he's not right for the job, we don't hire him. But I think he will be. Just give him a fair chance, William nodded. He was a good man who believed in second chances. He'd grown up poor himself and had built a career through hard work. He understood what Daniel was trying to do, even if he didn't know the full story. As William headed out to find Robert, Daniel felt nervous for the first time in decades. Not nervous about losing money or a deal falling through. Nervous that maybe Robert wouldn't want the job. Nervous that maybe he'd see through the whole thing and feel insulted. nervous that this plan, which seemed so perfect in his head, might fall apart. But it was too late to turn back now. The wheels were in motion. And deep down, Daniel knew this was the most important thing he'd done in his entire life. More important than any building he'd ever constructed or any deal he'd ever closed. This was about restoring faith in humanity, starting with his own. Robert was sitting outside the public library, trying to stay warm in the April morning sun, when a well-dressed man approached him. The man was maybe in his 40s, wearing a construction company jacket and carrying a clipboard. Robert had learned to be cautious when strangers approached, but something about this man's expression seemed genuine. "Excuse me," the man said politely. "Are you Robert?" Robert felt his stomach tighten. When someone knew your name on the streets, it usually meant trouble. "Depends on who's asking," he replied carefully. The man smiled and extended his hand. "I'm William. I'm a project manager for Chen Development. I've been asking around the neighborhood and your name keeps coming up. Do you have a few minutes to talk?" Robert shook his hand, confused but curious. "Talk about what?" William sat down on the bench next to him. "We're starting a construction project in this area. A community development with housing, a community center, and small business spaces. We need someone who knows construction and understands this neighborhood, someone who can be our eyes and ears on the ground, work with the crews and make sure we're building something that actually helps people who live here." Robert listened, his heart beating faster. "And you think I could do that?" "I don't know yet," William said honestly, "but I've asked around. People say you're honest. You know your way around a construction site and you understand this community better than anyone. The church volunteers praise you. The other folks around here respect you. That's the kind of person we need." "I've been out of work for 3 years," Robert said, needing to be upfront. "I haven't held a real job since my injury." "I know," William replied. "But skills don't disappear, and character matters more than a resume. Are you interested in interviewing for the position?" Robert wanted to say yes immediately, but years of rejection had taught him to be cautious. "Why would you hire someone like me? There must be hundreds of people with better qualifications." William looked at him directly. "We're not looking for someone with the fanciest resume. We're looking for someone who will care about this project because it means something to them. Someone who will fight to make sure it's done right. Based on what I've heard about you, I think you might be that person, but like I said, let's start with an interview and see if it's a good fit." 3 days later, Robert walked into a temporary office trailer near the construction site. He'd washed his clothes at the shelter, trimmed his beard as best he could, and tried to look presentable. His hands were shaking as he knocked on the door. The interview was real. William asked tough questions about construction, about problem solving, about dealing with difficult situations. Robert answered honestly, drawing on his years of experience before the injury. He talked about quality control, about safety procedures, about the importance of treating workers with respect. Then William showed him the plans for the project, and something inside Robert came alive. This wasn't just another building. This was a vision. Affordable housing for families barely getting by. A community center where kids could learn skills and stay out of trouble. Spaces for local businesses to grow. "This is incredible," Robert said, studying the blueprints. "This could really change lives around here." "That's the idea." William smiled. "So are you interested?" "More than interested," Robert replied. "This is exactly the kind of project I used to dream about working on." William stood up and extended his hand. "Then let's give it a try. The job comes with a small apartment above what will eventually be a cafe. It's basic, but it's yours during the construction period and for 6 months after. The pay isn't amazing, but it's fair. We start next Monday." Robert shook his hand, barely able to process what was happening. He had a job. He had housing. For the first time in 3 years, he had a future. The apartment was small, just one room with a bathroom and a tiny kitchen. But to Robert, it felt like a palace. He had a real bed, a shower, a door that locked. That first night, he lay in the bed and cried. Not from sadness, but from overwhelming relief and gratitude. He threw himself into the work with everything he had. He arrived early every morning, stayed late into the evening, and treated every detail like it was his own project. He learned the names of every construction worker on site. He asked about their families. He made sure everyone felt respected and valued. The crews noticed. They'd worked on plenty of projects before, but this one felt different. The guy coordinating everything actually cared. He'd stop to help solve problems instead of just pointing them out. He'd bring water on hot days. He'd listen when workers had concerns instead of dismissing them. William reported back to Daniel regularly. "You were right about him," William said during one of their phone calls. "Robert's not just good at this job. He's exceptional. The workers love him. He catches problems before they become expensive mistakes. And the way he talks to the neighborhood residents who stop by to check on progress, it's like he's building this for his own family." Daniel smiled on the other end of the phone. He'd been watching from a distance, never revealing himself. He'd drive by sometimes and see Robert on site, animated and engaged, looking 10 years younger than when he'd first seen him under that bridge. The transformation was beautiful to witness. 6 months into the project, the development was really taking shape. The housing units were going up. The community center's frame was complete, and the centerpiece building, the one being constructed on the exact spot where Robert used to sleep, was beginning to rise from its foundation. Robert would sometimes stand at that spot, looking at what was being built and feel overwhelmed. He thought about that cold November night when he'd given Linda his last bread and only blanket. He thought about all the dark days and long nights since then, and now somehow, impossibly, he was helping build something beautiful right where he'd once had nothing. He still didn't know the whole truth, didn't know about Daniel watching that night, didn't know about the careful planning that had gone into creating this opportunity for him. He just believed he'd gotten lucky, that someone had finally given him a chance to prove himself. But that was about to change. November was coming around again, 1 year since that night that had changed everything, and Daniel had one final surprise planned. The surprise that would reveal the real reason this building stood where Robert had once slept in the cold. The morning of the grand opening arrived, exactly 1 year after Robert had shared his last bread with Linda. The entire community development was finally complete. The affordable housing units already had families moving in. The community center had started offering programs. Small business owners were setting up their shops. And the centerpiece building, the beautiful 3-story structure that Robert had helped oversee from start to finish, stood proudly at the heart of it all. Robert had pressed his best shirt that morning, the one he'd bought with his first paycheck. He still couldn't quite believe how much his life had changed. He had a steady job, a place to live, money in his pocket, and dignity restored. As he walked to the ceremony, he felt grateful for every single day of the past year. The crowd was already gathering when he arrived. Neighborhood residents, construction workers, city officials, everyone who'd been part of making this project happen. Robert saw some of the families who'd just moved into the new apartments, parents who now had an affordable place to raise their kids. He saw teenagers heading into the community center for a music program. This wasn't just a building project anymore. It was a living, breathing community. William spotted Robert and waved him over. "Big day," he said with a smile. "Incredible," Robert replied. "I still can't believe we pulled it off." "You pulled it off," William corrected him. "This project succeeded because of your dedication." As the ceremony began, Robert stood near the back of the crowd, not wanting attention. He was just happy to see the community celebrating. William took the microphone first, thanking everyone involved. Then he said something that made Robert's heart skip. "And now, I'd like to introduce the man whose vision made all of this possible, the founder of Chen Development, Daniel Chen." Robert had never met Daniel Chen. He'd seen the name on paperwork, of course, but the owner had never visited the site during construction. Now, as an older gentleman walked to the microphone, Robert felt curious about the person who'd made this entire project happen. Daniel took the microphone, but he wasn't looking at the crowd. He was looking directly at Robert with an expression that seemed almost emotional. That's when Robert started to feel like something unusual was happening. "A year ago," Daniel began, his voice steady but filled with feeling. "I was sitting in my car just a few blocks from here. My car had broken down and I was frustrated, annoyed, thinking about all the important things I had to do. But then I saw something that changed my entire life." Robert felt a strange sensation in his chest. "A year ago, right around here, I saw a homeless man sitting under that bridge," Daniel continued, pointing to the old bridge visible in the distance. He had almost nothing. Just a sleeping bag and a small piece of bread. And I watched him give that bread to a woman who was even more scared and alone than he was. Then I watched him give her his only blanket. The crowd had gone completely silent. Robert's legs suddenly felt weak. "That man taught me something I'd forgotten," Daniel said, his voice cracking slightly. "He taught me that wealth isn't what you keep in your bank account. It's what you're willing to give when you have nothing left to give. He taught me that humanity and kindness matter more than all the success in the world." That man was Robert. Robert couldn't breathe. Everyone was turning to look at him. His mind was racing, trying to process what he was hearing. Daniel stepped away from the microphone and walked directly to Robert. The crowd parted to let him through. When he reached Robert, his eyes were wet with tears. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner," Daniel said quietly, "but I needed you to earn this opportunity, not feel like it was charity. Everything you've accomplished this year, you did through your own hard work and skill, but I need you to know why this project exists in the first place." He turned back to the crowd, still standing next to Robert. "I spent decades building a real estate empire. I made millions of dollars, but I'd become someone my own daughter couldn't stand to be around. She told me I'd lost my soul, and she was right. Watching Robert that night, seeing him give everything he had to a stranger, showed me what I'd become. It showed me the difference between being rich and being wealthy in the ways that truly matter." Daniel turned back to Robert, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a set of keys and an envelope. "This building we're standing in front of, the one that stands exactly where you used to sleep, belongs to you, Robert." Robert shook his head, confused. "I don't understand." "The first floor is a community cafe," Daniel explained. "It will provide jobs for people trying to get back on their feet. The second floor has 2 apartments for people transitioning out of homelessness. You'll manage them if you're willing. And the third floor is a full apartment that's yours, completely paid for. The deed is in this envelope in your name with no strings attached." The crowd erupted in applause, but Robert couldn't hear it over the roaring in his ears. He looked at the keys in his hand, then at the building, then back at Daniel. "Why?" he whispered. "Because you saved 2 lives that night," Daniel replied. "Linda's and mine. You gave her hope when she had none. And you showed me what it means to be human again. This isn't charity, Robert. This is gratitude. You gave everything when you had nothing. I'm simply giving when I have everything. And honestly, you're still teaching me how to do it right." That's when Robert saw Linda pushing through the crowd. She was dressed professionally, looking healthy and confident, nothing like the scared, shivering woman from that night. A little girl held her hand. "Robert," Linda called out, tears streaming down her face. She reached him and threw her arms around him. "I never forgot you, never. You saved my life that night." Her daughter looked up at Robert with curious eyes. "Mommy says you're the nice man who helped us," she said. Robert knelt down to her level, his own tears falling freely now. "Your mom's pretty amazing," he told her. "She just needed a little help to get started." Linda pulled him up and hugged him again. "I got the job at the marketing firm. I have my own apartment. My baby is with me, and it all started because you cared enough to share your bread with a stranger." Robert looked around at all the faces watching him, the construction workers he'd worked alongside, the families moving into affordable housing, the teenagers who'd have a safe place to learn and grow, the small business owners getting their start. All of this entire community had grown from one simple act of kindness on a cold night. Daniel placed a hand on Robert's shoulder. "I've learned something this year," he said. "I've watched you work. I've seen how you treat people, how you fight for quality, how you care about every detail of this project. You were never really poor, Robert. You were rich all along in the ways that actually matter. I'm just helping the rest of the world see what I saw that night." Robert finally found his voice. "I gave away bread because I knew what it felt like to be hungry and scared. I gave my blanket because I remembered my first cold nights on the streets. It wasn't heroic. It was just human." "Exactly," Daniel smiled. "It was human. And somewhere along the way, I'd forgotten how to be that. You reminded me." The ceremony continued, but for Robert, everything felt like a dream. He walked through his new building with Daniel, Linda, and William. The cafe on the first floor was beautiful, with tables and chairs ready for the grand opening tomorrow. The second floor apartments were simple but dignified, perfect for people rebuilding their lives. And the third floor, his floor, was more than he'd ever imagined having again. Standing in his new living room, looking out the window at the community below, Robert thought about the journey. 3 years of sleeping rough, 3 years of cold nights and hungry days, 3 years of rejection and loss, and somehow impossibly, all of it had led to this moment. "I don't know what to say," he told Daniel. "You don't have to say anything," Daniel replied. "Just promise me one thing. Promise me you'll keep being exactly who you are. Keep helping people. Keep showing the rest of us how to be human. This community needs you, Robert. I need you." Robert nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. Later that evening, after everyone had left, Robert sat on his new couch in his new apartment. He thought about calling it a miracle, but it wasn't really. It was just kindness meeting kindness. One act of giving had rippled outward, touching more lives than he could have imagined. The next morning, Robert woke up in a real bed, in his own home, ready to start his job managing the community programs. But before he headed downstairs, he made himself a simple breakfast. Toast with butter. As he ate, he smiled, remembering that cold night when he'd shared his last bread. He'd given everything he had, never expecting anything in return. And somehow everything had returned to him 1,000 times over. Not just a building or a job, but purpose, dignity, and the knowledge that kindness was never wasted. The mansion that stood where he'd slept wasn't just made of bricks and wood. It was built on something stronger. It was built on the simple truth that how we treat each other when we have nothing matters more than what we accomplish when we have everything. And that truth would continue to ripple outward, touching lives, changing hearts, reminding everyone who walked through those doors that humanity and kindness are the greatest wealth we'll ever have. 6 months after the grand opening, the community development had become more than just buildings. It had become a home for dozens of families and a symbol of hope for the entire neighborhood. Robert woke up every morning still amazed that this was his life now. He managed the cafe on the first floor, coordinated the transition apartments on the second floor, and lived comfortably on the third floor of the building that stood where he'd once slept on cold concrete. But something even more unexpected was happening. The story had gotten out. Despite Daniel's attempts to keep things quiet, word spread through the neighborhood about the homeless man who'd shared his last bread and the millionaire who'd witnessed it. A local newspaper picked it up, then a regional news station. Soon, people from all over the city were talking about it. Robert didn't like the attention at first. He wasn't comfortable being called a hero. "I just did what anyone should do," he'd tell people who stopped by to meet him. But Daniel would smile and shake his head. "That's exactly the point, Robert. What anyone should do, but most people don't." The cafe became a gathering place for the community. Robert hired people who were trying to rebuild their lives, just like he had. Former homeless individuals, people coming out of difficult situations, anyone who needed a second chance. He trained them, encouraged them, and helped them believe in themselves again. One of his first hires was a young man named Kevin, who'd been living in his car after losing his job. Kevin was ashamed, defeated, ready to give up. But Robert saw something in him, the same spark he'd once had before life knocked him down. "I'm going to tell you something," Robert said to Kevin on his first day. "Your circumstances don't define you. Your character does. You show up, you work hard, you treat people right, and everything else will follow." Kevin proved him right. Within 3 months, he'd saved enough to rent one of the affordable apartments in the complex. Within 6 months, he was training new employees himself. The cycle of giving continued, rippling outward in ways Robert never imagined. Daniel started coming by the cafe regularly, usually early in the morning before the crowd arrived. He and Robert would sit with coffee and talk. They'd become friends, these two men from completely different worlds who'd found common ground in the most unexpected way. "My daughter called me last week," Daniel mentioned one morning, his voice carrying a weight of emotion. Robert looked up. He knew Daniel's relationship with his daughter had been broken for years. "That's wonderful. What did she say?" "She said she'd been reading about this project. About what happened that night. She said—" Daniel paused, wiping his eyes. "She said she was proud of me for the first time in years. She wants to meet for dinner next month." Robert reached across the table and squeezed his shoulder. "That's what happens when you let yourself be human again. People find their way back to you." The transition apartments on the second floor were changing lives too. Linda had been the first success story, but she wasn't the last. Robert worked with each person who came through, helping them navigate resources, find jobs, rebuild confidence. He understood their struggles because he'd lived them. One afternoon, a woman named Patricia moved into one of the transition apartments. She'd been living in a shelter with her 2 teenage sons after her husband died suddenly, leaving them with nothing. She was overwhelmed, scared, and exhausted from fighting just to survive. Robert sat with her that first day, helping her fill out job applications. "I know it feels impossible right now," he told her, "but you're stronger than you think. You've kept your boys safe, you've kept moving forward. That takes incredible strength." Patricia started crying. "I just don't want my sons to be ashamed of me, to see me as a failure." "Listen to me," Robert said firmly. "Your sons don't see a failure. They see a mother who fights for them every single day. They see courage and love. One day they'll tell their own children about how strong their mother was during the hardest time of their lives." 6 months later, Patricia had a full-time job as an office manager. Her sons were thriving in school. She moved into one of the affordable housing units in the complex, and she never forgot what Robert had told her. She'd thank him every time she saw him, but Robert would just smile and say, "You did the work. I just reminded you that you could." The community center next door became a hub of activity, too. Kids came after school for tutoring and sports programs. Adults took job training classes. Seniors had a place to gather and socialize. The entire neighborhood felt different now, more connected, more hopeful. One evening, Robert was closing up the cafe when he noticed an older man sitting on the bench outside. The man looked tired, carrying a worn backpack, the familiar look of someone who'd been on the streets. Robert recognized it immediately because he'd worn that same expression for 3 years. He walked outside and sat down next to the man. "Evening," Robert said casually. The man nodded but didn't speak. "You hungry?" Robert asked. "I've got some soup left inside that'll just go to waste." The man looked at him suspiciously. "Why would you do that?" Robert smiled, remembering a cold November night when someone had asked him the same question. "Because somebody should be kind. Because you look like you could use a warm meal. Because maybe tomorrow someone will be kind to me when I need it." They sat together while the man ate the soup Robert brought out. His name was George, and he'd lost his apartment after medical bills from a heart attack ate through his savings. He was embarrassed, ashamed, trying to figure out his next move. Robert told him about the resources in the area, the shelters that were safest, the places that offered real help. He told George about the job board in the community center and the programs available. Then he did something else. "Listen," Robert said, pulling out a business card. "This is my number. You call me if you need anything. A reference for a job, someone to talk to, whatever. You're not alone in this." George took the card with shaking hands. "I don't understand. You don't even know me." "I don't have to," Robert replied. "I just have to remember what it felt like when someone showed me kindness when I had nothing." As George walked away with a full stomach and a pocket full of information, Robert felt that familiar warmth inside. The same feeling he'd had a year ago when he'd given Linda his last bread and only blanket. The feeling of being truly wealthy, not in money, but in the ability to help another human being. He looked up at the building, his building standing tall where he'd once had nothing but cold concrete beneath him. Daniel had given him this incredible gift. But Robert understood now that the real gift wasn't the building. It was the reminder that kindness matters, that every small act of compassion ripples outward in ways we can't predict. Robert locked up the cafe and headed upstairs to his apartment. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new people to help, new opportunities to pass forward the kindness that had saved his life. And somewhere in the city, George was finding a shelter bed with a little more hope than he'd had that morning. The cycle continued, one act of kindness at a time, building something more valuable than any mansion could ever be.